At the end of Don't Lose Your Head, Anne says she's obvs the winner and will prove it with another solo, a song she wrote about the moment she found out Catherine of Aragon had tragically died, and it's called Wearing Yellow to a Funeral. Hit the lights! This is hilariously true. Anne reportedly did wear yellow to Catherine's funeral, and there's a few theories as to why. Yellow was the Spanish colour of mourning, and Catherine was Spanish. However, in England, yellow was a symbol of joy and celebration, and Henry and Anne were definitely the kind of people to find that hilarious. Oh yes, we're definitely wearing it as a sign of mourning, wink wink. Anyway, at this point in the show, Jane steps forward for her turn to sing, which all the other queens think is ridiculous. She was the one Henry truly loved, the only one to give him a legitimate heir. What bullshit did she have to deal with exactly? Jane replies that she knows that she was lucky, that her marriage to Henry was happier than the other queens. But she also knows that Henry wasn't all bad, that he loved his former wives even when they were raging and screaming at each other. But she didn't do that. She stood firm like stone because she loved him, no matter his flaws and his temper. And then all of that, all her joy, her devotion, her dreams of seeing her son grow up, were all ripped from her when she died. You can build me up, you can tear me down, you can try, but I'm unbreakable. You can do your best, but I'll stand the test. You'll find that I'm unshakable. Heartstone is more a love song than one which recounts history the way the others do, and as a result there isn't a lot in the lyrics to analyse, so let's just talk a bit about who Jane Seymour really was. Jane Seymour was a maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon, but probably worked as one of her ladies-in-waiting since about 1527. My script says 1927, I don't think so. 1527. She became a lady-in-waiting to Anne when she became queen in 1533, and Henry became interested in Jane as early as 1536, not long after the death of Catherine of Aragon and around the time of Anne's third miscarriage. Jane and Henry were engaged on the 20th of May 1536, the day after Anne's execution. Talking about dancing on a grave. They were married 10 days later in the Palace of Whitehall, and as a wedding present, Henry gave Jane, brace yourself, 104 manor houses across 4 countries. 104! She became queen on the 4th of June. Jane was pretty much the polar opposite to Anne in every way. She was formal and demure, she didn't like extravagance or opulence. The big parties that Anne loved to throw stopped completely when Jane became queen. She banned the fancy French fashions that Anne introduced to the court, and she tended to stay out of political matters. The one time she did get involved was when she asked for pardons for the participants in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Henry rejected her request and quickly reminded her of what happened when Anne meddled in his affairs. Jane also spoke publicly of her sympathy for Catherine of Aragon and built a strong bond with Catherine's daughter Mary, which made her much more likeable to the people of England than Anne ever was. She even managed to reconcile Henry and his estranged daughter. Jane's motto as a queen was bound to obey and serve, which links in quite nicely with the firm, unshakable devotion that she expresses in Heart of Stone. Jane became pregnant in January 1537, which was a source of great joy for her and Henry. Henry doted on her during her pregnancy and got only the best physicians and midwives to care for her. On 12th October 1537, she gave birth to the baby Henry had awaited so long, a male heir who they named Edward. Edward was christened 3 days later without Jane in attendance, which was the custom at the time, although she probably wouldn't have been able to attend anyway due to how ill she was. Mary and Elizabeth carried Edward's train during the ceremony, which is really sweet. But Jane had had an awful labour with Edward. It had lasted around 60 hours and a total of over 3 days. She was extremely ill after the delivery and ended up dying on the 24th of October 1537, only 12 days after the birth of her son. Her cause of death is disputed, simply due to how long ago it was. The main theories, as I said earlier, are an infection of the retained placenta, postpartum infection of the reproductive tract, or a pulmonary embolism. Jane received a queen's funeral on the 12th of November, 1 month after she gave birth to Edward, and was the only one of Henry's wives ever to receive a royal send-off. Her stepdaughter Mary acted as the chief mourner, and she was buried at Windsor Castle. 10 years later, Henry would be buried next to her, despite having 3 wives after her. Heart of Stone is all about Jane's dedication to her marriage. She says that even though Henry can be angry, forceful, difficult, she still loves him and that she will withstand whatever he throws at her. You can build me up, you can tear me down, you can try, but I'm unbreakable. But in the second verse, we can hear the doubt coming in. Jane knows that part of the reason Henry is so devoted to her is because she is his new ticket to an heir. He was the same with Anne at the beginning, until he turned on her when she didn't give him a son. In the final bridge, she expresses her sadness over not being able to see her son grow, which I'm sure was heartbreaking for the real Jane. I always think dying in childbirth is one of the cruelest fates in the world. Carrying your baby for 9 months and then dying while giving birth to them is just absolutely hideous. And hideous for your partner as well, I think. You know, I always think it must be horrific to go in, you know, even nowadays, to go into the hospital with your partner all excited because you're about to have your baby and you come home with the baby but no partner. Like, that's just unthinkable. Even so, as Anne points out, getting your head chopped off is probably worse than dying during childbirth. I do feel like the show glosses over the fact that Anne Boleyn was murdered by her child's father when her daughter was only 2. Jane keeps bringing up that, you know, she never got to see her child grow up, but neither did Anne, and she didn't get to raise Elizabeth either really much during the first 2 years of her life because she ended up going to prison, so, you know, they both had a very similar fate in the end. But anyway, now it's time to take a trip to the House of Holbein, yeah!
Welcome to the house! To the house of Holbein!
The title of this song is a fun play on words. House is the German word for house, house. But it's also a reference to the House of Gaga, Lady Gaga's creative team, i.e. her glam squad. The idea in this song is that the wives are portraying Hans Holbein's glam squad who dress up the girls that he paints for his portraits. The entire song is about the female beauty standards and leads into the story of how Anne of Cleves became married to Henry VIII. Hans Holbein was a German-Swiss painter who lived from 1497 to 1543 and, as the song states, travelled around the world painting all of the beautiful girls. He also produced religious art, satire, and Reformation propaganda and was heavily involved in book design, but he's best known for his Renaissance-style portraits. Holbein had a long career before Henry VIII entered the picture, but that's where we'll pick up the story. Holbein returned to England from Basel, Switzerland, in 1532, and for a while he was very close to the Boleyn family and painted many portraits of Anne, though a number of them were destroyed because of her treason. In 1536, Holbein was hired as the king's personal painter. He painted many portraits of Henry, including some of the most famous images of the king, as well as of Jane and their son Edward. After Jane's death, Holbein was asked to paint portraits of prospective brides. And this is what the king chooses one, but which one will it be line refers to. The next lines refer to corsets, waists of 9 inches, and makeup with lead in it. The 9-inch waist is obviously an exaggeration, and funnily enough, despite them being referenced a few times in the show and used in the costuming, corsets weren't actually fashionable in Britain until at least the 1550s. But the lead in the makeup is true. Cosmetics at the time tended to be lead or mercury based, in particular the powder that women used to give themselves their ghostly white skin that was so popular at the time was actually lead powder and highly toxic. On top of this, nightshade, a deadly plant, was used to make the eyes large and shiny, and lips were painted with cochineal, a bright red dye made from insects, which all just sounds absolutely disgusting, to be quite honest. It reminds me of the Radium Girls. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of the Radium Girls, but these girls that worked in a radium factory were told that radium was good for you, so they used to like use it to whiten their teeth and stuff, and then they all developed cancer and all their like jaws like melted, and it's really horrible. You should look it up. But it's very much like that, but in the 1500s. The next line is full of puns. Ignore the fear and you'll be fine, we'll turn this fear into a 9. Vier is German for 4, but it sounds like fear, and 9 sounds the same as the German word nein, which means no. So it can be read as we'll turn this 4 into a 9, or we'll turn this fear into no, as in no fear. Turn your fear into no fear. So just say yes and don't say no. Later in the song comes one of the best puns I've ever heard. We know what all the best inventions are to hold everything up. It's wunderbar. 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 Great wordplay. The blonder hairlines refer to the way that Tudor women would bath in urine and ammonia to bleach their skin and hair, and I don't know why they hated themselves so much. Like, girlies, no man is worth bleaching your skin and wiping lead all over it and bathing in pee. I don't care if he's the king, it's just not worth it. Stop. We cannot guarantee that you'll still walk at 40 line is quite clever. Aside from the fact that heels do knacker your legs and feet, and I can attest to this because a few months ago I wore heels for like literally a few hours one day and then had insane pain in my feet for the next 2 weeks. It's also a reference to the short lifespan at the time. Only 2 of Henry's wives actually lived to the age of 40. You marry the king, you should expect a hasty trip to the afterlife. The House of Holbein playoff goes further into the way that Holbein painted portraits of the prospective wives of Henry, presenting it as a type of Tudor Tinder, which in essence it kind of was. Henry was given a pile of portraits and picked a wife purely from the picture and the little information he had on them. And I kind of imagine it, he had a pile of portraits and maybe he put some on the left and some on the right, maybe he picked up the ones that he liked and put them on the right, and the ones that he didn't like he put them on the left, and he literally was swiping left and right. This could have been the original Tinder. This part of the show isn't on the album, so you really need to kind of see it to understand it. I don't think it was on, I know they've just recently released the Broadway album. I don't think it's on the Broadway album, but I could be wrong. The point is you really need to see it. It works better on the stage. So the House of Holbein present 3 possible options for the king. I also realised at this point while I was writing it that that's also how Farquaad picks a queen in the first Shrek movie. Like, the mirror gives him 3 options. And then I was very scarred. Anyway, the first option is Christina of Denmark. Christina was a Danish princess, the youngest surviving daughter of Christian II of Denmark and Norway and his wife Isabella of Austria. She'd been married by proxy at 12 years old to Francesco II Sforza. Yes, that Sforza family. Caterina Sforza from Assassin's Creed 2's family. He died in 1535, which sparked a war in Italy, but more importantly to this story, it left Christina a widow and a possible wife for Henry. Christina sat for her portrait wearing a black mourning dress. She was only 16 at the time, but despite her age, was very vocal about how much she did not want to marry Henry. She supposedly said, "If I had 2 heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." Henry finally gave up on pursuing Christina when it became clear her aunt, Mary of Hungary, hated him too much to ever let him marry her niece. Next up is Amalia of Cleves, Anne of Cleves' younger sister. Holbein had been asked to paint portraits of both sisters for Henry to choose from. Spoiler alert, he didn't pick Amalia. And finally we have Anna of Cleves. The House of Holbein swears that Holbein has done her justice in the portrait and they will be happily married for many years. But we all know that's not what happened. Anne goes on to explain how she was brought to England and presented to the king but didn't live up to his expectations. On paper, Anne wasn't a perfect match for Henry's tastes. He valued education and cultural sophistication in women, but Anne had no formal education. She was, however, talented at sewing and could play cards. She was recommended instead because she was gentle and virtuous and docile. She was described as being of middling beauty and of very assured and resolute countenance by the French ambassador Charles de Marillac. Chronicler Edward Hall described her as having hair hanging down which was fair, yellow and long. She was apparelled after the English fashion with a French hood which so set forth her beauty and good visage that every creature rejoiced to behold her. Henry was not impressed when he met her, saying she is nothing so fair as she had been reported. He blamed Cromwell for having Holbein paint an exaggerated version of Anne. In the song, Anna addresses this with the cutting line, "It's the usual story. The savvy, educated young princess deemed repulsive by a wrinkled, wheezing, ulcer-ridden man 24 years her senior."
Too bad I don't agree. So I'm gonna hang it up for everyone to see. And you can't stop me, 'cause I'm the queen of the castle. Get down, you dirty rascal. Get down. Get down. Get down, you dirty rascal. Get down.
Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII were married in January 1540, despite Henry's reservations, but the marriage was never consummated. The marriage was annulled 6 months later in 1540. However, Henry had no ill will towards Anne as a person. He liked her a lot, he just wasn't in love with her. As such, he gave her a generous annulment settlement, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle. After the annulment, Anne was known as the king's most beloved sister and spent a lot of time at court. Henry even decreed that she would be given precedence over all women in England, apart from his own wife and daughters. Anna addresses this in the show by saying, "How can anyone overcome a fate as tragic as being forced to move into a resplendent palace in Richmond with more money than I could spend in a lifetime and not a single man to tell me what to do with it? It's just tragic." Anna certainly has the happiest song in the show. It's all about how she lived a life of leisure after her divorce from Henry, and in truth, she really did have a great life. She's the only wife that really benefited in any way from her time with Henry. The song opens with Anna sitting alone on a throne in a palace that she happens to own. Anna was given a lot in her divorce settlement, including Richmond Palace, which later became home to Elizabeth I during her reign, but has sadly been demolished since. Hever Castle, which had previously belonged to Anne Boleyn's father Thomas and is still standing to this day, and a lovely little house in East Sussex now known as Anne of Cleves House, which is now a kind of museum-cum-function venue. She then references her lack of sophistication that Henry felt she had, saying she eats pheasant off the bone, spills mead in her gold-laced dress while drinking, and is not very prim and proper. As we know, Anne wasn't Henry's ideal woman due to her lack of formal education and cultural sophistication. But here, we see that she couldn't really care less. Whether she was really like that in real life is unknown, but it's fun to imagine. She's also the only queen who gets to swear with the "unleash the bitches" line, which probably adds to the whole rough around the edges idea. The next lines refer to her spending her days playing croquet, which is a bit of an anachronism since croquet didn't really become popular for another 100+ years. But ground billiards was popular at the time and they're pretty similar. But that doesn't fit into the song as well, and people probably don't know what ground billiards is. She also states that she's a player, which probably relates to the fact that Anne never remarried and just was single and ready to mingle for the rest of her life. She hits replay because every day is just her living her life and loving it. She just has really good days every single day. What a queen. I imagine her kind of like, you know how Rebecca in Taylor Swift's The Last Great American Dynasty? I know she was a real woman, but like the idea of her just like going out and, you know, fell in the pool with champagne and swam with the big names and blew our money on the boys in the ballet. That's what I imagine Anne of Cleves was like. In the chorus, they go back to the idea of Anna catfishing Henry with her not looking like her profile picture. In the song, she says she doesn't agree and that she hung the portrait up for everyone to see. I've definitely heard that Anne kept her portrait and hung it up in Richmond, but I can't find any definitive sources on that. But I like to think it's true, because that would be really badass. In any case, it's in the Louvre now, so everyone can see it, which is nice, and I'm happy, because it's good to know that everyone can now look at her portrait and go, yeah, she is pretty. Fuck you, Henry. The rest of the chorus is Anna singing, "I'm the queen of the castle, get down you dirty rascal, get down," which is obviously referring to the nursery rhyme King of the Castle, which goes, "I'm the king of the castle and you're the dirty rascal," or where I'm from, "You're the dirty wee rascal." The history of that could be its own video, but in short, it seems to stem from a quote from Governess Thomas Coburn during the 1650 siege of Hume Castle, where he said, "I, Will of the Wassail, am king of my castle, all the dogs in the town shall gare gang me down." Over time, this evolved into the rhyme, which became a children's game, and the idea is that a bunch of kids compete to be the first one to climb to the top of a hill, and when one gets to the top, they shout, "I'm the king of the castle and you're the dirty rascals," and if one tries to get on the hill, they might push them down and say, "Get down, you dirty rascal." For Anne in the song, she's saying she's on top and Henry's down below. She's winning and he's losing. But also she's partying. She's telling everyone to get down and boogie because she's having a great time. And after all, she didn't dislike Henry and he didn't dislike her, so it's probably all a bit jokey and tongue-in-cheek anyway. The next verse relates to Anne's frequent visits to court after her divorce. She talks about riding in a carriage, flirting with the staff, and dressing in bold German fashions. She also acknowledges her power by saying, "as you were," to the staff after they are, presumably, stunned by her beauty. What a legend. Fucking love this woman. She talks again about being single and not wanting a man before calling herself more rad than Lutheranism. Lutheranism is a brand of Protestantism that arose in the early 16th century following the teachings of the German monk Martin Luther. not the Martin Luther that, fought for black civil rights, the original Martin Luther from the 16th century. At the time Anne of Cleves was alive, it was still very new and considered radical and viewed by the Catholic Church as heresy, but Anne's brother William was actually a Lutheran himself, and she was exposed to it even though she herself was a Protestant, until she converted to Catholicism to save herself from Bloody Mary's wrath. She follows it up with the iconic Beyonce reference, "Okay ladies, let's get in Reformation." After the next chorus, she references Kanye West by saying, "Now I ain't saying I'm a gold digger." She mentions her gold chains being a symbol of faith, and this is a reference to the large crucifix necklace she's wearing in the Holbein portrait. She finishes up by saying she's a Wiener Schnitzel, not an English flower. Wiener Schnitzel meaning hot dog in German. Referring again to how she's not the demure lady that Henry wanted, but she doesn't care because she's rich and doing her own thing. Anna had an interesting life after she and Henry divorced. She actually asked him to remarry her after Catherine Howard was beheaded, but Henry said no. Interestingly, Catherine and Anne were actually good friends, and it's thought that Catherine might have been one of Anne of Cleves' ladies-in-waiting. Later, when the news of Catherine's Parr marriage to Henry reached her, Anna said, "Madame Parr is taking a great burden on herself." Anna became very close to Henry's daughter Mary and took part in her coronation procession and was most likely present at the coronation itself. As mentioned earlier, Anne converted to Catholicism to please Mary, who became known as Bloody Mary for getting hundreds of Protestants either exiled or killed during her reign. Anne sadly fell out of favour though in 1554 when Mary became convinced that Anne played a part in her being overthrown. She ended up living out the rest of her life quietly in her various estates and was generally just quite happy. Chronicler Raphael Holinshed said that she was a lady of right commendable regards, courteous, gentle, a good housekeeper, and very bountiful to her servants. Anne outlived all of Henry's other wives. As her health declined, Mary allowed Anne to move into Chelsea Old Manor, the previous home of Catherine Parr after Henry's death. In her will, she left money to Elizabeth I, among others, as well as leaving money to her servants and asking Elizabeth and Mary to employ them after she was gone. She died on the 16th of July 1557, probably from cancer. She was the only of Henry's wives to be buried at Westminster Abbey, where her epitaph reads, "Anne of Cleves, Queen of England." According to Wikipedia, her tomb is somewhat hard to find, but can be found on the opposite side of Edward the Confessor's shrine, slightly above eye level for a person of average height. So if you're ever at Westminster Abbey, that's where you can find it. This section doesn't actually have a name, I just wanted to separate it from the songs because it's quite lengthy. After Get Down finishes, the Queen's question how any of that warrants her winning the competition. She admits that it doesn't, but she doesn't care because she has a palace. But the Queen start arguing. Anne thinks she should win because she was beheaded. Jane thinks that she should win because her son grew up without a mother. So did Anne's daughter. But Catherine of Aragon is sure that she's already won since she was shipped over from a foreign country not knowing a word of English to marry some random dude, which Anne of Cleves points out also happened to her. Aragon says that Henry didn't even say goodbye, to which Anne Boleyn and Kay Howard point out that he didn't say goodbye to them either. And they lost their heads to boot. Aragon goes on to say she wasn't allowed to see her daughter when she was sick, but Jane cuts in that she didn't get to see her son at all because she died. To which Anna jumps in that she has the plague, but she's joking and her life's amazing. Go Anna. Catherine Parr decides it's time to hear from the next wife, Catherine Howard, but the other queens say that she's the least relevant Catherine. They are unfortunately kind of right. Catherine Howard is generally seen as the most forgettable of all of the wives due to the short time she was with Henry and the little impact her marriage had on the country at large, and probably also the fact that she was so young that she didn't really have a lot of impact on the world at all. Aragon thinks there's no way Catherine can compete with them, and Catherine has a response. "I'm gonna need all the luck. Your life sounded terrible, and your songs really helped to convey that." She goes around the wives in turn, laying into them, and you have to see it. It's just hilarious, particularly when Samantha Polly does it in the Broadway version, so I'm going to put a clip here and hope it doesn't get my whole video cancelled.
I mean, Catherine, almost moving to a nunnery and then not? That almost could have been really hard for you. And getting your head chopped off. Surely that means you'll win the competition. Oh, wait. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded. Oh, never mind. And Jane, dying of natural causes. surviving. But seriously, Anna, all jokes aside, getting rejected for your looks legit sounds really rough. I wouldn't know anything about that. I mean, look at me, I'm really hot. So yeah, I can't even begin to think of how I compete with you all. Oh wait, like this.
And this, of course, brings us to the best song in the show. All you want to do is basically Toby and Lucy Colbert bumping Henry VIII's fifth wife. Before Six, the complexity of Catherine's life was really only known to Tudor fanatics and historians. But when Toby Marlowe and Lucy Moss gave her the best and longest song in the show, it turned into a fan favourite. And I'm so glad, because Catherine went through so much in her short life, and her story deserves to be told. Catherine was born in the early 1520s as the 10th child of her mother Joyce Culpeper, and the 5th child Joyce had with her second husband, Edmund Howard. Edmund's sister, Elizabeth Howard, was Anne Boleyn's mother, making Anne and Catherine first cousins. She was also related to Jane Seymour through her grandmother, who was Jane's grandmother's sister. Catherine's mother died only a few years after Catherine was born, and Catherine and some of her siblings were sent to live with Edmund's stepmother, Agnes Howard. Despite being a wealthy dowager duchess, Agnes had little time for her new wards. Agnes was often at court and left the children with the attendants, who were not much older than the children themselves, and as a result, the house was pretty much one big unsupervised party, what we in Scotland would refer to as an empty. As a child, Catherine was described as vivacious, giggly, and a joker. She loved to dance, but often played up in lessons. She also loved animals, especially dogs. She wasn't very academic or particularly devout to any religion. She was a free spirit, through and through. All You Want to Do starts while Catherine was still living at the Dowager Duchess's house around 1536. Catherine would have been between the ages of 11 and 15, but most likely about 12. She was having music lessons with the tall, broad, sexy Henry Mannix. Henry's age has been disputed, but it's thought that he was in his early mid-20s, so 23 is probably a good rough guesstimate. The first verse of Catherine's song is full of sexual innuendo. She refers to Mannix teaching her dynamics, as in the dynamics of music, meaning the volume of a piece, but also the dynamics of sex and power dynamics of a relationship. She also talks about strumming, striking, blowing, and plucking the G-string. Then making a reference to minor and major, as in an adult and a child. She makes it sound so fun, but it's very, very gross to imagine. How consensual Catherine and Mannix's relationship was debated by historians. Of course, to modernise, a child can't consent to a sensual relationship in any way. Biographers Rita M. Warnick and Connor Byrne both think that Mannix groomed Catherine. Gareth Russell believes that the age gap between the pair was smaller and therefore not a case of grooming, but he also believes Catherine was repulsed by Mannix's pressure to allow him to take her virginity, and she was upset that he was talking about it to the servants. When questioned about the adultery during her marriage to Henry VIII, Catherine admitted to having a physical relationship with Mannix, but not to having penetrative sex. She said, "At the flattering and fair persuasions of Mannix, being but a young girl, I suffered him at sundry times to handle and touch the secret parts of my body, which neither became me with honesty to permit nor him to require." Catherine stopped all contact with Mannix 2 years later, and the exact reason isn't known, although some sources say it was a result of Agnes discovering the affair and locking Catherine in her bedroom at night. The next section of the song refers to Catherine's relationship with Francis Dereham. Francis would have been about 30 years old while Catherine was 14 or 15. Francis was Agnes's personal secretary and therefore lived in the same house as Catherine. It was said that Catherine and Francis would often be seen eating and drinking together and being merry until the early hours of the morning. Despite Catherine being locked in her room, she managed to smuggle Francis in by convincing a maid to bring her the room key. This relationship does seem to have been consummated, as Catherine would later say, "Francis Dereham by many persuasions procured me to his vicious purpose, and obtained first to lie upon my bed with his doublet and hose, and after within the bed, and finally he lay with me naked, and used me in such sort as a man doth his wife many and sundry times, but how often I know not." The relationship is said to have lasted 3 months and was ended when Henry Mannix wrote to Agnes and told her to visit Catherine's room half an hour after bed in order to see that which shall displease you. As a result, Francis was exiled from the house and moved to Ireland. Francis actually gave Catherine £100 before he left, most of his savings, and told her it was hers to keep if he didn't return. Francis moved back to England in 1540 and became a secretary at Hampton Court. He went on to cause quite a bit of trouble, as in 1541 he approached the now Queen Catherine and asked her for a job. She made him her private secretary and then a gentleman usher, but Francis kept boasting that he would marry Catherine if the king died, which was a reckless thing to say. It was his big mouth that caused the word of Catherine's past relationships to reach Henry and lead to the arrest of Agnes, her son William, Thomas Culpeper, Queen Catherine, and Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford. Francis said in his questioning that they did have a premarital relationship, but hadn't been intimate after Catherine married. He also said Catherine now preferred Thomas Culpeper anyway. Because of Francis' boasting, rumours swirled that there was a pre-contract of marriage between him and Catherine, and if that was true, her marriage to Henry VIII would have been unlawful. If it was true, however, there was no evidence, as Agnes burned all the documents that incriminated them. Ultimately, Francis was sentenced to a traitor's death, and hung, drawn, and quartered. After Francis left for Ireland, Catherine got a job as one of Anne of Cleves' ladies-in-waiting. In the song, Catherine introduces Henry as tall, large, and the supreme head of the Church of England, rather than the sexual language she used for Mannix and Dereham, suggesting that she wasn't as attracted to Henry VIII. She also insults his big bushy beard. By this point in Henry's life, he was overweight, had bed sores and ulcers, and suffered from gout, all brought on from his grief over losing Jane Seymour. He was also 50 years old, while Catherine was only about 16, so he probably wasn't her type, and who could blame her? Henry's interest in Catherine really did hurl her family up in the world. The Howards and the House of Norfolk, whilst well-connected, were not wealthy or influential. However, once Catherine gained the king's favour, she was showered with gifts and the house's influence grew. Henry referred to Catherine as the very jewel of womanhood, which is so creepy considering she was only 16, and Charles de Marillac said that she was delightful. Henry and Catherine married on the 28th of July 1540, also the day of Cromwell's execution. She adopted the French motto, non autre volonté que la sienne, meaning no other will but his. For a while things were good. Catherine was too young to actually take on any state work, so she basically just spent her days hanging about in court, wearing French fashions, jewels and gold. Henry lavished Catherine with gifts after their wedding, and for Christmas said he would indulge her every whim. But things started to go downhill in the winter. Henry would go into terrible moods from the pain in his legs and would yell at his counsellors. However, he improved again in the spring, suggesting he might have suffered from some kind of seasonal affective disorder. At this point, the court were preparing for a royal pregnancy. Marillac said that if Catherine became pregnant, they would seek to crown her on Pentecostal Sunday, since she hadn't had an official coronation yet. However, things would take a turn for the worse not long after Easter. Rumours spread that Catherine had been meeting in secret with Henry's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper. The meetings had been arranged by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George. The truth only emerged when Mary Lascelles, one of the attendants from Lambeth Palace, Agnes's house, mentioned to her brother that she didn't want to be part of the Queen's household due to the way she witnessed Catherine conducting herself back in Lambeth. John Lascelles then told the Archbishop of Canterbury about this, who saw the perfect opportunity to bring down the Queen, as the House of Norfolk were rivals to the Archbishop's family. The Archbishop interrogated Mary Lascelles, who spoke of Catherine's relationships while living in the Duchess's house. He then interrogated Lady Rochford, Catherine's lady-in-waiting, who agreed to talk out of fear of torture. She spoke of how she used to watch in the back stairs while Thomas Culpeper fled from Catherine's room. During the investigation, a love letter in the Queen's handwriting was found in Thomas's chambers. It's the only physical evidence of a relationship, but was damning. The letter stated, "I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now, and my trust is always in you that you will be as you have promised me," and ended with the words, "yours as long as life endures." As such, it's likely that the relationship between Catherine and Thomas was consensual, rather than being a friend who took advantage of her as the song suggests. However, considering the way every man seemed to exploit Catherine, it's not hard to believe that she lost all sense of what a relationship was supposed to be. It's possible she didn't even know she could reject a man's advances and had no clue what to do when men kept propositioning her. Some have speculated that the relationship wasn't actually romantic, however, and was, in fact, born of political intrigue. Culpeper may have seen an opportunity for advancement by becoming close to the Queen, so that he would be her most favoured courtier when the king died. Indeed, Culpeper said that he and Catherine had never slept together, and there isn't anything in Catherine's letter that explicitly states she had romantic feelings about him, meaning it's possible they really were just close friends. On the 1st of November 1541, Henry received a letter with allegations against Catherine. 6 days later, the Archbishop took a group of councillors to interrogate the Queen. Catherine was allegedly frantic and deeply upset. The Archbishop said, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart to have looked upon her." He even feared she might attempt to take her own life and ordered the guards to remove anything that could be used to do so. If Catherine had agreed that there was a pre-contract of marriage between her and Francis Dereham, it would have ended her marriage to Henry, and she could have been exiled rather than executed, if Henry had so wished. But Catherine was defiant that no such contract had existed. Catherine was stripped of her title as Queen on the 23rd of November, 1541, and banished to Sion Abbey. She was ordered to return the ring that the king had given her. Henry stayed at Hampton Court and never saw his fifth wife again. Thomas Culpeper was executed on the same day as Francis Dereham, although Thomas had the less brutal death of beheading. Both their heads were displayed on London Bridge, which was a common punishment for traitors at the time. A Bill of Attainder was passed on 7th of February 1542, meaning that Catherine was found guilty without a trial. This was because of the Royal Assent by Commission Act 1541, which was passed in 1542, and made it treason and punishable by death for a queen consort to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. Catherine's prior relationships meant that whether she cheated with Culpeper or not, she was still guilty of treason and could be executed, which is a bit shitty because that law didn't exist when she actually married Henry, but they made it retroactive so that she could be accused of treason for a crime that wasn't a crime when she committed it. That's also sort of how the Nuremberg trial worked, so that's not always a bad thing, but in this situation it's a bad thing. Catherine screamed hysterically as she was manhandled into the boat that would take her to the Tower of London on the 10th of February 1542. She sailed under London Bridge and could see the heads of her former lovers on the spikes. She entered the tower through Traitor's Gate and was imprisoned until her execution date 3 days later. The night before her execution, Catherine asked for the chopping block to be brought into her room so she could practice laying her head on it. At 7 a.m. the following morning, she was helped onto the scaffold, looking pale and terrified but composed. Her last words consisted of asking for forgiveness for her sins and acknowledging that she deserved to die 1,000 deaths for betraying the king, who had always treated her so graciously. She described her punishment as worthy and just and asked for mercy for her family and prayers for her soul. She was then beheaded via a single stroke of the axe. She was likely only 17 at the time, and 21 at the very most. Her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, who had claimed Catherine was sexually involved with Culpeper, was executed immediately after. Catherine and Lady Rochford were both buried in an unmarked grave in Tower Chapel, near to Anne and George Boleyn. Sadly, Catherine's body was not identified when the chapel was restored, so we still don't know exactly where her remains are, but she's commemorated on the chapel plaque. And so ended the short yet very eventful life of the least relevant Catherine, a lifetime consisting of 2 decades of chaos and tragedy, being endlessly passed from man to man. Her story deserved to be told, and I'm glad that Toby and Lucy gave that to her. I'm sure the real Catherine would appreciate it. After the song ends, Catherine declares that she's won the competition and thanks all the powerful men for getting her to that point. But the other queens disagree and they all start arguing. Jane says that Catherine's song wasn't that heart-wrenching, despite the 4 choruses, and that her son growing up without a mother was worse. Anne chimes in that it's not Catherine's fault that no one remembers her because her beheading didn't have the drama and humiliation that Anne's did. Catherine of Aragon interjects that she was humiliated more due to Henry's 3 historically confirmed mistresses. Anne replies that she had 3 miscarriages, and Catherine ups her by saying that she had 5 miscarriages. Anna thinks it's time that we hear from the final wife. But Catherine Parr doesn't want to sing. She points out the horror of the fact that they're competing for the biggest cheer for drama or abuse, arguing over who had the most miscarriages. The other queens say she's just pretending to have a conscience because she knows she won't win, so Catherine P decides that if it's a sob story they want, it's a sob story they'll get. Catherine tells the audience how she, like Henry, had been married a few times before. though she didn't end any of those marriages by having her spouse decapitated. Instead, they just kept dying. But finally, she met the love of her life, and she was so excited to marry him, at the exact same time that Henry VIII set his sights on making her his new queen. And that was that. And her song is her letter to Thomas, ending their relationship.
It's true, I'll never be over you, 'cause I have built a future in my mind with you, and now the hope is gone, there's nothing left for me to do. You know it isn't true, but I must say to you that I don't need your love, no.
I Don't Need Your Love starts out as a heartbreaking ballad to Thomas Seymour before turning into a girl power anthem about the numerous achievements that Catherine Parr had throughout her life that no one talks about because she's always just labelled as Henry's sixth wife. So let's talk about Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr, Lord of the Manor of Kendal and Maud Green, one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting. She was also granddaughter of Sir Thomas Green, a member of the English gentry who was eventually executed for treason. Thomas Parr was a descendant of King Edward III, making the family very influential in society. Thomas was also close with Henry VIII and held positions such as the Sheriff of Northamptonshire, Master of the Wards, and Comptroller to the King. Catherine had a good education and loved learning. She was fluent in French, Latin, and Italian, and began learning Spanish after becoming queen. Catherine's first marriage was in 1529 at just 17 to Sir Edward Borough, the son of a baron, and who worked as a justice of the peace. Edward had a tough upbringing due to his violent father and was reported to possibly suffer from mental health struggles. Even in his 20s, Edward kept poor physical health. For a time, Catherine and Edward lived with his family, and Edward's father was known to try and intimidate his daughters-in-law, even having one thrown out of the house. Records show that Catherine was not intimidated by him, however, and was stern against his temper. In 1530, the couple moved out and lived happily in Curtin and Lindsay. Sadly, their happiness ended 3 years later when Edward died. The Borough family had no interest in keeping Catherine after this, so she was out on her own. Being a widow with no support from her spouse's family was not good form for a woman at the time, so a year later, in 1534, Catherine married John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, her father's second cousin. Latimer came with baggage, being twice widowed with 2 children and financial difficulties. However, the marriage gave Catherine a home and a title, so it was a good move overall. But things became unpleasant for Catherine in 1536, however. As a supporter of the Catholic Church, Latimer was expected to participate in the Lincolnshire Rising. When he didn't, the rebels dragged him from his home, leaving Catherine behind with her terrified stepchildren. For 6 months, Catherine was home alone with the children, struggling to make ends meet without her husband's income. It's thought that this act by the Catholic supporters may have been the catalyst for Catherine's devout Protestantism. Later, in January 1537, Catherine and her stepchildren were taken to Snape Castle and held hostage, while the rebels sent word to Latimer that if he didn't return immediately, they would kill his family. For a while, the King and Cromwell weren't sure if Latimer was a prisoner or a conspirator, though ultimately no charges were brought. Latimer's reputation was irreparably tarnished though, and the family moved down to London, where Latimer worked at Parliament. Catherine spent a lot of time at court visiting her brother William, and there she also met Thomas Seymour, as well as developing a liking for the fashion and jewellery of the upper class. Latimer died in 1543, leaving Catherine as guardian of his daughter Margaret. He also left Catherine Stowe House, a large, beautiful manor in Buckinghamshire, with money to support Margaret, and instructions that if Margaret wasn't married within 5 years, Catherine was to take £30 a year out of the income to support her. Catherine kept Latimer's diary for the rest of her life and seemed to truly love and mourn her second husband. Widowed once more, though in a better financial position than the last time, Catherine had to look for a new path. She knew Mary I from when her mother was Catherine of Aragon's lady-in-waiting and decided to see if she could move into Mary's household and become part of court. She did just that, and soon began a relationship with Thomas Seymour, who she'd met previously. However, being a part of Mary's household had also put her in the king's cone of vision, and he soon set his sights on her. Catherine felt it was her duty to accept the king's proposal, and Thomas was sent to serve in the military in Brussels to keep him away from Catherine and the king. Catherine married Henry VIII on the 12th of July 1543 at Hampton Court Palace. She was the first Queen of England to also be Queen of Ireland following Henry's adoption of the title of King of Ireland. Catherine was known as a good and caring queen. She made her former stepdaughter, Margaret Neville, her lady-in-waiting, and gave her stepson John's wife, Lady Somerset, a position in her household. Catherine was also partially responsible for reconciling Henry with his daughters from his first 2 marriages, and she developed a good relationship with Henry's son Edward. Her uncle, Lord Parr of Horton, became her Lord Chamberlain. After Catherine finishes her letter to Thomas, she switches up and sings about her own achievements. She mentions that she became the one who survived, the final wife, but there's so much more to her. And she's right. Remember that I was a writer. I wrote books and psalms and meditations refers to Catherine's books. Psalms were prayers taken out of Holy Scriptures, published using the King's printer in April 1544, and prayers or meditations, published in June 1545. Both books were bestsellers. Princess Elizabeth even translated the second book into Latin, Italian, and French as a New Year's gift for Henry VIII in December 1545, and presented the manuscript in a beautiful hand-embroidered cover. Her third and final book was Lamentation of a Sinner, published in late 1547. Fought for female education refers to the way she speaks in Lamentation of a Sinner, boldly referring to men as conscientious disputers, foul gluttons, slanderers, backbiters, adulterers, fornicators, swearers, and blasphemers. She didn't feel shy in expressing those thoughts in her book, despite being a woman, and she felt women should take pride in their learning and education. Her progressive attitude towards women for the time was said to have heavily influenced the way Elizabeth I reigned and lived her life in general. There's no evidence of women ever painted Catherine's picture, but it is possible. Susanna Hornible was the first known female artist in England, and she served in the Queen's household from Jane Seymour through to Catherine Parr. During that time, she painted many portraitures for the king, and may have painted Catherine at some point as well. Then comes the part that breaks my heart a little. Why can't I tell that story? 'Cause in his story, I'm fixed as one of 6, and without him, I disappear. We all disappear. Catherine points out that all she and the other queens are remembered for is being married to Henry. No one remembers Henry VII's wife, or Henry VI, or Henry V. Well, apart from Catherine Howard, apparently. No one remembers because they weren't important to history, and the only reason the 6 are all known at all is because of how chaotic their marriages to Henry were. They don't have their own stories, they're just his wives. Kay Howard says it best. Whenever they get together, they just compare themselves. When they're the 6 wives of Henry VIII, that's all they become. And as Anne adds, when the only thing we have in common is our husband, grouping us is an inherently comparative act and as such it unnecessarily elevates the historical approach ingrained in patriarchal structures. For a moment, the queens ponder what to do next. What are they if not the 6 wives of Henry VIII? At which point the truth is revealed. The competition was fake, a ploy to demonstrate how messed up it is to compare the wives. Because they do have their own stories, and they've been telling them for the past hour and a half. Because they're not just one of 6. They are badass queens of England in their own right, and they don't need any man. Not Henry VIII, not Cromwell, not Mannix or Francis Dereham or anyone to give them worth. It's time for a remix.
It's not one went down in history, but tonight I'm singing it's for me. Henry outgrew too many times it's been told, and I am had enough love stories to get old.
Together, the queens reject Henry and the hold he has over their lives and declare that they are telling their own story from now on. They don't need him. They never needed him. And it doesn't matter if it's not quite what really happened. This is them finally putting the record straight. Or at least, Toby and Lucy will put it straight on their behalf. This was never a story about Henry VIII's wives. This was a story about 6 badass women, the shit they endured, and how they dealt with it. This is about 6. Since it's not really mentioned, I'm just going to conclude Catherine Parr's story here. In 1546, the Bishop of Winchester and Lord Wriothesley tried to turn the king against her. An arrest warrant was drawn up for her, and rumours abounded across Europe that the king was attracted to her close friend, the Duchess of Suffolk. However, she saw the warrant and managed to reconcile with the king after vowing she'd only argued about religion with him to take his mind off the suffering caused by his ulcerous leg. The following day, an armed guard who was unaware of the reconciliation tried to arrest her while she walked with the king. It obviously didn't go ahead. Shortly before he died, Henry made provision for an allowance of £7,000 per year for Catherine to support herself. He further ordered that after his death, Catherine, though a Queen Dowager, should be given the respect of a Queen of England as if he were still alive. Henry died on the 28th of January 1547. 3 days later, Catherine retired from court after the coronation of her stepson, Edward VI, and went to live at her home in Old Manor in Chelsea. Not long after Henry's death, Thomas Seymour returned to court and re-proposed to Catherine. She accepted, although she knew the Regency Council would not allow a Dowager Queen to remarry so quickly, so instead the couple married in secret. King Edward VI and the council were not informed of the union for several months. When their union became public knowledge, it caused a small scandal. The King and Lady Mary were not impressed at all, and being censured and reprimanded by the council, Thomas wrote to Lady Mary asking her to intervene on his behalf. Mary became furious at his forwardness and tasteless actions and refused to help. Mary even went as far as asking her half-sister Lady Elizabeth not to interact with the Queen Catherine any further. You might have noticed Thomas's surname is a bit familiar, and he was actually the younger brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife and King Edward VI's uncle. Catherine had a fairly volatile relationship with the Seymour family, particularly Thomas's brother Edward and his wife Anne. Anne argued that as a Queen Dowager, Catherine was no longer entitled to wear the jewels belonging to the wife of the king. Instead, she, as the wife of the Protector, should be the one to wear them. Eventually, the Duchess won the argument, which left her relationship with Catherine permanently damaged. The relationship between the two Seymour brothers also worsened as a result, since Thomas saw the whole dispute as a personal attack by his brother on his social standing. In March 1548, at the age of 35, Catherine became pregnant. However, around this time, Catherine caught Thomas in an embrace with Princess Elizabeth. Elizabeth was sent away, though she still communicated with Catherine and sent her a remorseful letter. Catherine gave birth to her only child, a daughter, Mary Seymour, named after Catherine's stepdaughter Mary I, on August 30th, 1548. Sadly, Catherine died on the 5th of September 1548 at Sidley Castle in Gloucestershire from, presumably, an infection developed during childbirth. So despite no longer being married to Henry, she ultimately suffered the same fate as his third wife, her late sister-in-law, Jane Seymour. Catherine's funeral was held on the 7th of September 1548. It was the first Protestant funeral held in English. Her chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey. She was buried in St Mary's Chapel on the grounds of Sidley Castle. In a truly bonkers turn of events, Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason only 4 months later after breaking into the King's apartments in Hampton Court Palace. He entered the Privy Garden, awoke one of the King's pet spaniels, and in response to the dog's barking, Thomas shot and killed the dog. He was then executed on the 20th of March 1549, and Mary Seymour was sent to live with Catherine's friend, the Duchess of Suffolk. There's no record of Mary after her second birthday, leading historians to believe that she must have died as a child. Catherine wasn't really able to rest in peace, sadly. Her grave was disturbed in January 1643 during a siege in the English Civil War. Her coffin was reopened in 1783, 1784, 1786, and 1792, when local vandals broke into the coffin and threw the corpse in a rubbish heap, leading to Joseph Lucas of the English gentry reinterring the body in a hidden walled grave. The last time the coffin was opened was in 1817, when a local rector decided to move it to the crypt under the chapel. When opening it the final time, it was found that the body had been reduced to a skeleton, with much of the coffin filled with ivy. The coffin was last moved in 1861 to its final location in the fully restored chapel under a canopied neo-Gothic tomb designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, with a recumbent marble figure by John Burney Phillip, and that's where she rests until this day. The gals get ready for their final song. They realise now that they aren't known because of Henry. Henry is known because of them. No one remembers Henry VII's wife, but does anyone remember Henry VII? No, because he didn't have 6 rad as hell wives, that's why. Henry VIII is famous for having 6 wives. He isn't the one that made them famous. They made him famous. The Queens point out that there's nothing they can do about how their lives ended, but they can tell the story of what they would have done if it wasn't for Henry ruining their lives. And that's exactly what they do. Obviously, this is the least historically accurate song on the show since it's about a future that never happened, but we'll talk about it anyway. Catherine of Aragon decides her future would have been to move into the nunnery and join the choir. Anne Boleyn decides to start writing her own poetry and ends up writing for Shakespeare. Which isn't right, considering Shakespeare was born in 1564 and Anne would have been about 60 by then, and with the health back then, probably would have died before Shakespeare written a word, but anyway. Jane forms a family band with the multiple children she had after she didn't die in childbirth. Anna decides to go and work with Hans Holbein back in Germany and teach everyone how to party. Kay Howard tells Mannix to do one and learns music on her own, becoming a famous singer. And Catherine Parr decides to pull the other queens together into a pop group, forming them into six. Together, the queens tell us that they've changed history, changed the prefix. They want the audience to know that nothing is for certain, that your story is yours to write and no one else's. And that most importantly, they're one of a kind, no category. Too many years lost in his story. They're free to take their crowning glory for 5 more minutes. They're 6.
We're one of a kind, no category. Too many years lost in his story. We're free to take our crowning glory for 5 more minutes. We're 6. Whoa, whoa, we're 6. Whoa, we're 6.
And that is it for 6. I absolutely adore this musical, and I like to think that if the wives could see it, that they would be proud. I know that in reality they would be horrified by the music, the dancing, the outfits, the fact that women are standing up and doing these things in society would be terrifying to them, but I'd like to think that once they go over the shock, they would realise that their stories have lived for 500 years and that no one ever forgot them, that the impact that they had on society has never been forgotten, and that they are looked at as heroes, that women all over the world look to the 6 wives of Henry VIII as icons of what it is to be a woman. And I like to think that they would be proud of that. I hope they know that their legacy is so much more than being just Henry VIII's wives, and that Henry VIII is only remembered for having 6 wives, that that's his only achievement, and that what they achieved in their lives is so much more than what he ever achieved. I hope they know that, because they deserve to know that. And so that's it. That's 6. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being with me on this journey. This is the longest script I've ever written. It is 35 pages. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I absolutely love Tudor history. I love 6 as a musical because the songs are bops, but Tudor history is my thing. So I really like getting to talk about it, which is why I just don't shut up. I just rambled on for 18,365 words apparently. So thank you for sticking with it. I hope you had fun. If you've never seen 6, dear God, go and watch it. It's one of the best musicals there is. And I'm gonna go and get myself some lunch. So once again, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in whatever I put up next. Bye.
We're 6. Whoa, whoa, we're 6. Whoa, we're 6. Whoa, whoa, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 more minute. We're 6. So much more than divorce, beheaded. Die, divorce, beheaded. They're right here. 6.
We're one of a kind, no category. Too many years lost in his story. We're free to take our crowning glory for 5 more minutes. We're 6. Whoa, whoa, we're 6. Whoa, oh, 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 we're 6. Whoa, whoa, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 more minute. We're 6.